We've had a comprehensive national debate on this matter over the last 10 months. The Constitutional Commission received over 100 submissions from the public, held 2 months of public hearings, deliberated, and published their report 2 months ago. I spoke about the matter at the National Day rally, and I followed up in a Media Corps interview. In September, the government published a white paper setting out the changes that we would make, and my colleagues have held many dialogues with groups of different backgrounds and ethnicities. And yesterday, we began debating the bill in this House. It has been an important and a necessary debate because changes to the Constitution, as major as this one, determine the direction for the country. And I'm glad that many Singaporeans have taken interest, brought their minds to bear on the matter, and have given their views. The details are necessarily voluminous and complex. Yesterday, DPM Teo Chee Hean spent 90 minutes explaining the bill. Today, let me focus on 2 fundamental points: the elected president as an important stabilizer in our system, and the need for the presidency to be multiracial. First of all, why is the elected president an important stabilizer in our system? Let me start with a bit of history. Singapore did not begin with a fully conceived constitution. When we separated from Malaysia and became independent, all we had was the state constitution for Singapore within the Federation of Malaysia. It was fit for purpose for Singapore as a constituent state in a federation, but not a complete constitution for an independent country. To get that, we took a practical approach. We grafted pieces from the Federal Constitution of Malaysia onto our state constitution, and so it became the Constitution of the Republic of Singapore in December 1965. It was patchwork, it was inelegant, but it provided us a working basis to start from. It was such a messy document that in 1970, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew asked the British to help draft us a more elegant, comprehensive, and enduring constitution. The idea was to have something like the US Constitution, amended only 27 times over 200 years, with a beautiful, timeless form of words that everyone knows and venerates, and that will guide the country for many more years to come. The British law experts, who had drafted many constitutions for different Commonwealth countries, came back with a shiny new constitution. From the legal point of view, they did a first-rate job. But in the end, Mr. Lee decided not to use it because the drafters did not understand our circumstances and our history and did not have direct experience of Singapore, what worked and what would not work. So we stuck to our patchwork constitution, which took into account the idiosyncrasies of our history and our circumstances. It was a document that our people understood and were used to, and which worked. And as time passed, we amended it repeatedly and adapted it to our needs. Mr. Lee famously described it as being like stretching and occasionally resoling and easing into worn-out old shoes. Instead of buying a brand new pair, beautiful, shiny, but which would not fit as well. And that has been our constitutional path over the last 50 years. Our Constitution is a living document. It has evolved as our needs changed, and it has served us well. The journey of our Constitution reflected how our political system evolved. As a newly independent country, with a state constitution as a basis, we started off with a unicameral legislature. It's a big word to mean a single House of Parliament. At that time, the PAP occupied every seat in Parliament and had the full support of the people. the opposition was virtually non-existent. Mr. Lee and his team could have done anything they wanted if they had wished. But we were fortunate that our founding fathers were capable, responsible, and trustworthy stewards. And they used the freedom of action which they had to steer Singapore safely through many dangers. And they operated the system in the long-term interests of Singapore. As Mr. Lee once said, if he had wanted to, he could have changed this into a one-party state. But he did not, because he preserved the democratic system in order that you have a government which is lean, subject to competition, and which will serve the long-term interests of the country. But even then, Mr. Lee and his team were conscious that the system was not inherently robust and that they needed to build up state institutions like the civil service and the courts. We would always need good people in politics, but we also required sound institutions. And by the early 1980s, the time was ripe for us to consider what more we needed to do. Because by the early 1980s, after 2 decades of nation building, we had accumulated a nest egg of reserves. Mr. Lee worried that one day we might have a freak election result and the money would be squandered by a profligate government. Our public service had also established a reputation for impartiality, integrity, and quality. And if the service ever got corrupted, especially the key appointments, it would be impossible ever to clean it up again. In fact, in the 1959 general election, when the PAP first came into office, Mr. Lee and his colleagues thought very carefully before deciding to fight to win, because they knew they were in a weak position vis-à-vis the communists in the PAP. And if they fought to win, after they got into government, they would have a big fight with the communists in the PAP. But nevertheless, they decided to go for it and to win. And the consideration was, if they didn't win and another team came in, corrupted the civil service, that would be the end. And if the PAP came in a term later, it would be unable to put things right again. That's how important maintaining the integrity of the public service was to our founding generation of leaders. So, after 20 years with the reserves to worry about, with the civil service at a high quality, Mr. Lee proposed the idea in 1984 of an elected president. And the idea was debated, refined, eventually legislated in 1990. For the past quarter century, since we've implemented the scheme, the elected presidency has worked well and become a valuable part of our political system. It's unique. Other political systems may have stabilizing institutions like an upper house or a constitutional court or an executive president, separate from the parliament. But no other country has anything quite like Singapore's elected president. It's a unique system, very difficult to get right, because the balance is a delicate one. A symbolic head of state, but elected through a national ballot. With a popular mandate, but not a mandate to govern. He can use his mandate to say no in certain areas, but not to push for policies or to initiate action. The presidential election itself presents some difficulties. In a fiercely contested campaign, emotions and sentiments can build up, and issues that have nothing to do with the role of the president can become hot. Candidates may then make claims, promises, and declarations which go beyond the president's powers and competence under the Constitution. We saw that happen in the 2011 presidential election. One candidate championed a $60 billion economic plan, supposedly to create jobs and enterprise. Another candidate made proposals such as better recognition for national servicemen or more help for the poor and unemployed. But these are the government's responsibility for the Prime Minister and the Cabinet to decide. The person who is standing for election as the guardian of the reserves is offering as his platform to open the doors and make free. It's not for the president to promise these things in a campaign or push for them after being elected. But in 2011, some candidates' attitude was, never mind, just say it, get elected first, worry about the Constitution later on. But for all these difficulties, I'm convinced that the elected president has been a plus for our system. Having this stabilizer is critical and has already made a difference. Even though it's not easy to get right, we should persevere to improve the system. We can find ways to mitigate the difficulties and will do so, because the alternatives to the elected president will create other, probably worse difficulties.